Welcome to the show. This is our second edition focusing on climate change talks in Paris. Now, the latest is that all may not be well. Developing countries may not achieve their targets, and all indications are that the commitments and promises made by heads of state and government at the opening of this conference may just have been a political talk show. African nations are raising concerns.
There's absolutely nothing tangible yet.
In their opening statements, the leaders seem to have left no doubt about their commitments.
For our part, America's on track to reach the emissions targets that I set 6 years ago in Copenhagen. We will reduce our carbon emissions in the range of 17% below 2005 levels by 2020.
Climate change continues to adversely impact Kenya's social economic development, and my government has therefore joined the international community to pledge voluntary national measures and actions for emission reduction and enhancing adaptation to climate change.
We will tell you more about the gaps and concerns at the climate change conference in Paris, who is who in Kenya's delegation, and why members of the Maasai community are not left behind. They were here to represent indigenous communities of Kenya. We will tell you their concerns, how climate change affects them, and how they apply indigenous knowledge to deal with the change.
Narok, for example, the Mao forest, the Maasai Mao, with serious deforestation. We have seen how Mara rivers are drying.
But first, sights and sounds from the conference, beginning with tributes paid to some of Africa's icons. The late Nelson Mandela, there is a hall named after him in recognition of his efforts to bridge the gap between races in South Africa. There is the late Professor Wangari Maathai, a Kenyan Nobel Peace Prize winner. Like Mandela, she is remembered for her struggles to save the environment. Another notable thing about this conference is that most of the facilities here are environment friendly, or they pass a climate message. The walling is made of recycled wood. The ambience is all about green energy. The design allows in natural light, and so on. Welcome back. You are watching the Chamwada report. Now, earlier I spoke to the head of Kenya's delegation, Professor Judy Wahungu. She is the Cabinet Secretary for Environment and Natural Resources. And this is her take about the way negotiations are going. And this is after a draft agreement was released. Professor Wahungu, what does this draft agreement entail in brief?
We received the draft agreement this afternoon. What the draft agreement has, unfortunately, at this stage, is very many brackets. What very many brackets means that the negotiators themselves were not able to agree. They've now handed it over to the ministers, for the ministers now to use that political will to remove those brackets. The African ministers of environment will be meeting tomorrow to go through the draft. As you're aware, we are negotiating as a group. The Africa group, the G77 and China. So we, the Africans, want to look at those brackets, hopefully agree on those brackets tomorrow, so that when we are starting on Monday with all of the other ministers, we go with our position. Some of the areas that we are still not satisfied with are the areas of finance and the transparency and modalities of getting that finance. We cannot provide plans of what we plan to do in adaptation, say, and mitigation, if we don't know and cannot predict how we're going to get the funding. There's also the issue of ambition. We feel as Africans that many of the large emitters are not being ambitious enough when it comes to their mitigation plans. When it also comes to means of implementation, we're hoping that we can now tease out these issues so that going forward, parties know exactly what they're planning to get out of it.
We know that Africa was pushing for finance, climate finance. It was pushing for capacity building as well as technology transfer. So in this draft agreement, you mean there is nothing tangible yet towards those three goals?
There's absolutely nothing tangible yet. And that's why, if you repeat what the French minister said, is just basically we have a draft document. We as ministers have a lot of work to do, more than we actually anticipated. So now it's up to us, the African ministers and the group we're negotiating with, to iron out those issues: capacity building, technology, which we're all calling together means of implementation. But then also, what is the ambition? What is the ambition of the industrialized countries going forward? We expect them to do much more than they're promising to do at the moment.
Finally, Waziri, who are the key negotiators from Kenya? Who are the key members of the Kenyan team pushing this agenda?
Well, we have the Directorate, the Climate Change Secretariat. They're all here, so we've come heavy loaded. These are very experienced people. We also have the Ministry of Energy. The Renewable Energy Director is also here. From Forestry, the Director is going to be arriving tonight to join us tomorrow. We also have a team that is looking at the finance side from Treasury. So I believe as Kenya, we've come with the best team possible.
So African leaders and stakeholders, including the civil society and even heads of financial institutions, have been burning the midnight oil to ensure that Africa's voice is strong in the negotiations that are going on here in Paris. But they cautioned that they will not just sit and wait for financing from developed countries, but they will also find internal mechanisms in funding mitigation and adaptation to the impact of climate change. Here is the summary of one of the meetings where the African Development Bank promised to pump in more resources towards that cause.
Africa has been shortchanged by climate change. But we must ensure that Africa is not shortchanged by climate finance. COP21 can only be considered successful if it meets the needs of Africa. That is why the African Development Bank will triple its climate finance to $5 billion a year by 2020. Thank you. Which be at that time 40% of all of our portfolio. Africa loses today 3 to 4% of its GDP due to lack of energy. Lack of energy, ladies and gentlemen, has put the brakes on Africa's industrialization. This is simply not acceptable. Yet Africa has massive potentials for renewable energy. Our sunshine should do more than nourish our crops. It must light up our homes. Our massive water resources should do more than water our farms. They must power our industries. Potential is important, but homes and industries cannot be powered by potential. Africa must unlock its renewable energy potentials. And as we do, we will also renew Africa and turn it into a place full of light. What a new dawn that will be.
Talking about who is who from Kenya, there are parliamentarians here too. There is the Speaker of the Senate, Ekwe Ethuro, and members of crucial committees to environment and natural resources, the committees from both the National Assembly and the Senate. I spoke to the chairman of the Committee on Environment and Natural Resources of the National Assembly, Wilbur Otichilo.
As a country and as a continent, we are more concerned about adaptation. How are we going to adapt to climate change? Because it's here with us, it's not going to change. Even if we reduce global warming as of now to less than 2 degrees, the impacts of climate change is going to be there for the next 100 to 200 years. So we are here as a committee, we are legislators, to ensure that the agreement that comes out of, hopefully, out of this very COP21 is an agreement that will ensure that our environment is secured and specifically our water.
We take a short break and still to come.
Hata wewe umekuja na shuka ya kikwetu bana.
Why are members of the Maasai community at the Pahi Climate Change Conference? Right after the break.